council meeting for the 29th of September. So if you're dialing in and you're a council member, when I call out the council members who I've been able to see, if you could just let us know for purposes of the roll who's there, that would be great. So I have Bob Atlas, I have Dr. Berenson, I have Dr. Haft, Kevin Hayes, Dr. Okiki, Jean Ransom, Dr. Reedman. I see Tracy Laval, good afternoon, and Laura Russell, good afternoon. Am I missing any council members? And we have Ben Steffen, our executive director. Am I missing any council members at this point that didn't announce? Okay, I see Dr. Berkowitz. So good afternoon, Dr. Berkowitz. Anyone else that I might have missed? Okay, that said,
David, do we have HSCRC?
We have confirmation from Will Daniels, but I do not see him as of yet.
Okay.
So with that, let me turn this over to Dr. Reedman to make a couple of remarks. Dr. Reedman?
Okay, I hope everybody can hear me. I am rural and technologically challenged today, so if I fade in and out, I'm doing this by phone. So I'm going to actually limit my comments. I didn't want to miss the meeting even though I'm on vacation, and so I'm going to listen as much as anything else. Turn it over to David, but I'm looking forward. I think we're getting into the meat of our conversation. We had a good introduction last week and touched on the subject today, especially the making the track 3 mandatory or not. And so I'm looking forward to tonight's conversation. And again, I'll try to keep my comments to a minimum since it's hard for me to hear you all. And I apologize for any technological issues as we go along. So I'll turn it back over to David.
Thank you. And let me invite Melanie to give an operations update, please.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. So just a reminder, the meeting is being recorded. Please contact Anena or Melanie or send a chat message if you're having any technical issues. You can mute and unmute yourself using the small button at the bottom of your screen that looks like a microphone. Please remain on mute when you're not speaking to reduce background noise. Staff may mute you if there's a lot of background noise coming from your line, but you can always unmute yourself. So you can use the chat function to send notes to all attendees. You cannot send a chat message to specific attendees when using this technology. Please announce yourself when speaking. Since there are a lot of people in the meeting, we would like to sequence the speakers when possible. We understand that there are times people will want to respond immediately to a comment. How you signal the team, if you're interested in speaking, is you take a piece of paper, fold it in half and hold it up, or anything else you happen to have on your desk. It doesn't have to be a piece of paper. The meeting facilitator will call on people to speak. You may also be called on, if you don't have your paper up, just to ensure that we have a wide range of perspectives. So an additional reminder to just be aware of the position of your computer when you're holding up your paper to make sure that we can see it when you're waving it on the screen. So that's all I have, David. Back to you.
Okay, so welcome, Dr. Barr, Kathy Chapman. I think that was all the last minute additions that's come along. With that, I'd like to invite our executive director to make a couple of remarks. And Ben, you probably know you're muted.
Yes.
Okay.
I have no starting remarks. Why don't you kick us off?
Okay, very good. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. We'll jump right in. Dr. Haft, please proceed.
Yeah, thank you, David. Before I get started, because I usually forget to do this, I wanted to acknowledge the significant amount of really important work that the co-chairs do in between these meetings. We certainly acknowledge the fact that our advisory council members are showing up week after week for this important work, but the co-chairs are deeply involved in this. Ben Steffen, the executive director, and his staff, Melanie and others, are deeply involved, and the folks in the PMO are involved. So in between the Tuesday to Tuesday, there's a lot of things happening. And I wanted to report to you also that since we spoke last week, we've also engaged a consulting company to help us with doing some modeling that will be provided in the weeks to come to the Advisory Council, modeling around financial impacts and other issues related to the primary care first, moving to track 3, that I think will help shed light on the deliberations that you're making. And in the following week, we'll have a more detailed calendar for you in regard to when those presentations and when that data will be developed and shown to you. But it will largely speak to looking at a comparison between track 2 as it is now in terms of the overall program revenues compared to primary care first. If everything were the same and we just lifted and shifted to primary care first, how that would compare on an overall basis. And then some nuances that particularly that the Advisory Council has already asked for things like modeling on the flat fee and what that might most appropriately look like in the context of Maryland's primary care delivery system. So I think those are things that will be helpful to us and to you in terms of the future deliberations. But I wanted to also say that we are going to now, over the next months, be looking at these 2 large blocks of this primary care first to see how we can make them fit well into the context of the total cost of care contract and Maryland primary care delivery. And one big piece of that, of course, is the change in payments, where we'll be anticipating moving to largely, but not entirely, a capitated system, 60, 70, 75% capitated, along with a flat fee that would be on a fee-for-service basis. The other big portion, and more to come on that, and that's what a lot of the modeling will look like. The other big piece of this is how those payments will be adjusted on a performance and other basis on a quarterly or annual basis. And they're actually adjusted on a quarterly basis as opposed to where we are now. So we're going to have a lot more modeling on both sides. But I thought this week we might start by just doing a level set and a grounding, knowing that some of the Advisory Council members may be already deep into understanding the performance adjustments in primary care first, and others it may be new and news. But I think to level set, I thought we'd just go kind of verbatim according to how it appears in the RFA and other materials from CMMI about how the performance adjustments and payment adjustments are made in primary care first, just so we'll have an idea, and then we can later compare that to how they're made in track 2, which I'm sure you are much more familiar with, since that's the extant model. So I thought we'd go through just a quick slide set and then answer what questions you might have about those performance and other payment adjustments. So I think we'll show those on the screen, David?
Yes, Alana.
Okay, so this is primary care first performance adjustment design. Go to the next slide. And I hope everyone can see that. So under this model, participating practices professional population-based payment, which is basically the capitated portion, is combined with a flat primary care fee, which is based on E&M visits. And that's what comprises the total primary care payments, the TPCP. So we're moving from CPCP to TPCP. And that's a quarterly payment. It's adjusted quarterly. But that's adjusted based on a quarterly payment adjustment that will, whatever that net amount, the gross amount of what you assume that you would get, will be adjusted either up or down based on a couple of different features that we'll talk about. And that adjustment on a quarterly basis is what you get for that 3-month period. So all of the payments come as a one lump sum in a 3-month period, for the 3-month period, essentially. Next slide. Now let's break down what that looks like. So here's how the performance adjustments go in primary care first. they're applied on a quarterly basis, and the adjustment has the potential to increase a practice's quarterly payment by as much as 50% or decrease it by up to 10%. In year one, the adjustments are determined on a comparison to the national acute hospital utilization alone, and practices, in order to get any upward adjustment, need to be in the top 50% of the HEDIS benchmarks for national acute hospitalization measure. And beginning in year two, there's a multi-step process to determine the performance bonus, and it includes the quality gateway. So, but in year one, it's all what you get in year one is all about your previous years, and we'll show you in a moment how that's the look back period goes. How your previous year's ability to exceed the 50 percentile in terms of hospital utilization. So in the years after that, the first thing that needs to happen is, did the practice exceed the quality gateway? And the quality gateway is different depending on whether you're in group 1 and 2 or whether you're in group 3 or 4. And we'll talk about that later. But you need to get every element in the quality gateway in order to qualify for any increase. So any missing any one of the 5 elements would disqualify you for an increase, and failing those 2 years in a row is an automatic, or 3 years in a row is an automatic decrease of 10%. And we'll walk through how that works a little later. But if you do get through the quality gateway, then you're available to get either a 0 or a positive adjustment up to 50%. But there's several steps that need to be garnered. But if you don't meet the benchmark of 50% or better for hospital utilization, you're only available, even if you get through the quality gateway, which has to be all done completely, then you're available. If you don't get better than 50% in terms of national utilization, then the best you can do is 0, and the worst you can do is minus 10%. There is no gradation between 0 and 10%. It's all or none. Either you're at 0 or you're minus 10%. There's not a 5%, 4%, 3% in between those two. Let's go on to the next slide. So the quality gateway is a threshold for participating practices must meet or exceed starting in performance year 1 to be eligible for any positive performance bonus in year 2 or thereafter. There are 5 measures in the quality gateway, and minimal thresholds for those quality measures are available to practices at the beginning of each performance year. And they're set by CMMI. They could be national, they could be regional, they're set in a variety of different ways, but they're made available at the beginning of each performance year. And again, those thresholds need to be exceeded. They could be a 50%, it could be 60%. It's not stated what they are, but they're be stated at the beginning of each performance year. Practices that do not meet the minimum standard of quality for all the measures will own no higher than the 0% performance bonus adjustment the following year. And again, for each of the 5 quality measures, CMS will set a threshold based on national practice performance. Next slide. So in year 2, if a quality gateway is not met in year 1, the maximum is, so in year 1, if you don't meet the quality gateway, the maximum performance bonus for year 2 would be 2%. Performance bonus for minus 10%, whether a practice ultimately receives a neutral or negative performance bonus for each quarter of the second performance year will depend on its acute hospital utilization relative to both the regional and the historical benchmarks. In year 3 and beyond, failing to exceed the quality gateway in the previous performance year will result in an automatic negative 10% performance bonus, regardless of whether you exceed the acute hospitalization use benchmark. So in the year 3 and on, again, failing to exceed the quality gateway in the previous year means that you'll automatically get 10% less. And again, to meet the quality gateway, you need to to meet the benchmarks for all 5 of the elements. And we'll talk about what those elements are. Next slide. So performance above the 50 percentile, after the quality gateway is met, practices must exceed also the 50th percentile of a nationally constructed acute hospitalization benchmark. And this is specifically hospital use, not ED use, and it's different from how we're looking at things now. Interestingly, when we look at how our practices did for all of the MDPCP practices for our first year of participation in the program, 43% of the current practices exceeded the 50 percentile nationally. So 57% were below the percentile. So that would have put them in the 0 category. We don't know how many were lower than 25%, but if you were lower than the 25% benchmark, it's an automatic 10% reduction in the in your capitation. So again, if not met, the performance bonus is 0%. 0% performance bonus. Practices that fail to exceed the national benchmark but perform above the 25th percentile will receive, relative to their regional reference group, will receive 0. But if you are below the 50th percentile but fail to exceed the national benchmark, and you're in the bottom quartile, that is in the lower 25% for the regional reference group, then you lose 10% automatically. So there's two references. One is the national reference, and the other is your regional reference, which probably for us would be the state as a whole. So if you're in the bottom 25% of the state, then you automatically get a minus 10%. So next slide. There are 2 components to the performance bonus adjustment, the quality gateway and the acute hospital utilization. And the performance, the PBA has both a regional and a continuous improvement portion of it, which are added together to determine the practice's quarterly performance bonus. So there is this additional piece that's a continuous quality improvement. So practices, if they get over these other thresholds, if they're not in the lower quartile, if they're not in terms of their regional, if they're not in hospital utilization, if they're not below 50% in terms of national, and if they've achieved all of their quality gateway measures, then you can get a regional performance bonus, and you can also get a continuous improvement bonus. So that's if you've satisfied the other things, then you would qualify. And there's a slide that will show you how that works. Next slide. The regional performance bonus, CMS will establish a benchmark using data from regional reference group of peer practices that would include practices in the program, in the MDPCP, and those who are not in MDPCP. Obviously, wouldn't be primary care first practices. These would be track 3 MDPCP practices. The way it's currently done is they use a synthetic comparator group. So they use kind of a analysis and says, if we just took all of these beneficiaries and put them into artificial practices, what would those artificial practices look like in terms of a benchmark? That's how it's done currently for an MDPCP. So assume something like that would be done. And if that's done, again, if you satisfy all the other criteria in terms of the quality gateway and being above the 50% for hospital utilization nationally, then you can still receive up to 34% upside bonus or a minus 10% downside bonus. There are 7 levels possible in the regional performance bonus, depending on practice's performance relative to those. In Maryland would probably be these synthetic groups. High performers, that is the top 10%, can get the 34% regional bonus. Low performers, that is, even if you've gotten to this level, but regionally you're in the lowest 25% regionally, you get a negative 10% bonus. Go on to the next slide. So here are the categories for those 7. The bottom 10% get a minus 10%. I'm saying the bottom 25% get a minus 10%. Those that are between 25 and 50 is no increase. But those who are regionally, who again were nationally above 50, who have met all the quality gateways for that year, haven't failed the quality gateways in the previous year, can get between 6.5 and 34% increase. 34% is the top 10% in that group. Next slide. So there's also a continuous improvement bonus. So practices for acute hospital utilization will be compared to its own performance in the 4-quarter previous, immediately preceding the performance period, to calculate the practice's continuous improvement bonus. So the continuous improvement is based on hospital utilization alone. It's not based on quality or other things. It's paid to eligible practices each quarter, as long as each quarter it's adjusted, depending on how they achieve their improvement targets. The bonus, to receive the bonus, a practice's individual performance must have improved by a statistically reliable percentage threshold determined prospectively from the previous year. And CMMI will adjust the practice's continuous improvement score using the average score of like practices based on how confident they are in the practice's own continuous improvement score. So there is an ability to get, if you've improved year over year, to get some additional bonus based on some statistical significance and some benchmarks that CMMI will set to be determined. But it's not eligible for this unless they've passed the quality gateway and gotten to better than the 50% hospital utilization level. Next slide. So again, all of these adjustments are done on a quarterly basis. So here's how all of that is calculated. So if you look at the very dark blue green, that's where the light green, that tells you kind of the look back period for how your calculations are done. So your performance-based adjustment is applied to, if you look at year 2, quarter 2, the look back period, the darker green in the bottom quarter 4 level here is where the performance is calculated. So all in a 3-month period, CMMI will be doing these calculations and then making the payment the following quarter. The beginning of the last quarter of the rolling performance period is the lighter slide, and that goes back for 4 quarters for a year. So that'll be a look back period from quarter 4 to when you're paid in quarter 2. It's a look back period, begins in quarter 4 of year 1 and goes back through year 1. So it's that entire look back period. And then that rolls forward. So every quarter, CMMI would be doing another calculation based on hospital utilization for that prior year, based on the rolling information, and then making adjustments either somewhere between minus 10% to up to 50% positive, depending on all of those previously included factors. And then you would get a payment of each quarter that could vary as much as minus 10% to up to positive 50% quarter to quarter. Next slide. There's also a leakage adjustment. This is somewhat similar to what we have in the CPCP, where if patients are seen, if more patients are seen or less patients are seen in your practice over a period of time, there could be an adjustment for either, for churning or for sending patients to see somebody else. In this, there's a calculation of that produces the percentage of patients, of beneficiaries, primary care services that are provided outside of the practice, and that produces a leakage rate. And the practice's professional bonus is then adjusted based on this leakage rate. So if some of your patients are seen by another primary care practice for primary care services outside of your practice, it'll be adjusted downward based on that leakage. Next slide. There's no upward adjustment in this. And this is how the full quarterly payment calculation is made. It's a quarterly model payment, which is the total primary care payment plus or minus those performance adjustments, and then times the number of attributed beneficiaries plus the flat fee visit, which is included in that, time of geographic adjustment. So knowing that flat fees are geographically adjusted, times the total number of visits, and then that's the total primary care payment, and that's adjusted each quarter, either up 10% or down 50%. On to the next slide. So here's what's in the quality gateway. And again, all these need to be met in order to be able to get any bonus. And if you fail to meet this for any year, then it's a negative 10% for the following year. So patient experience, CAPS, diabetes, hemoglobin A1C, which we're very familiar with, controlling high blood pressure, which we're very familiar with, advanced click care planning, which is a very good measure, but not one that we've used previously, and colorectal cancer screening, which again is a good measure, but not one that we've used previously. And then utilization, as we said, was the acute hospital utilization. So this is for groups 1 and 2. If your practice winds up in a group 3 or 4, go on to the next slide, then advanced care planning and total per capita cost measure is also added as measures that need to be, that are added as additional quality measures. We'll go on to the next slide. I think that might be the last slide. Perhaps not. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. No. This is additional quality measures for groups 3 and 4. There's also a measure for days at home. This is a new measure that, if you're in this group, that it would look at, claims-based data collection through institutional dates of service. It's a novel measure that needs to be validated and have benchmarks still established, but that will be happening in primary care first over the first few years that it's out, and that's a measure to see basically how many days people your beneficiaries are spending with high quality life at home rather than being in an institution, in a hospital, or other places. Next slide. Is there a next slide there, Lana? Nope. Okay, so let me just to recap that. So for clarity, first you'll have these slides available to you. This is taken verbatim from the CMMI information, but I think the highlights are that that significant adjustments can be made every quarter in payments. That the quality measures are once a year, but hospital utilization is adjusted every quarter based on a 1-year look back, and that there are cliffs. Basically, if you fall below certain cliffs, if you don't achieve greater than 50% in terms of benchmark for hospital utilization, or don't get all of the quality gateway, then you're at best available for 0, and at worst 10%. But if you achieve both of those, then you can get anywhere from a positive percentage up to 50%. But 50% is for achieving both continuous improvement and also be in the top 10% of the region in terms of all the others. So there is both highs and lows in this, but it does call for significant every quarter adjustments in payments. So I think those are the key features, and I'm happy to answer any questions now.
So, Dr. Haff, before you begin, let me just welcome for the record Kathy Chapman, Advisory Council members Kathy Chapman, Will Daniel, Debbie Kuchka-Craig, Dr. Pham, and Robin Elliott. So, and I think Melanie had a question coming in.
It's not a question. I just want to clarify. The slides are posted on the MHCC website, and we'll make sure after the meeting that everybody has the link that for the slides that you saw today.
And thank you. And our first question comes from Debbie Kuchka-Craig, and then I believe Dr. Pham, if that was the signaling. No, okay. Very good.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, thanks to your team who gave me technical support today.
Yeah.
I was just curious, other programs that have this kind of quarterly fluctuation, how practices have fared. Because I've heard, loud and clear that practices like some, stability and that annual true ups are more welcome than all this quarterly fluctuation. And I guess most recently with COVID, I know, a lot of practices really felt it, even, having one quarter of a surge. So I'm just curious as to what your estimation is, Dr. Haft, in terms of how this will be received, these fluctuations, especially on smaller practices, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I don't think I have an answer to those, I know the quarterly fluctuations as occurred during COVID were very hard for particularly small practices to tolerate. This would be, at most a 10% fluctuation downward. And I think, we'll continue to model this out, but I don't think anyone has a good answer because we haven't seen anything like this that would have, a swing of -10 to +50 on a quarter-to-quarter basis in the past. So, both of those things, if practices was scoring quite well and had a 30 or 40% increase for several quarters, and then got used to that, and then had a -10% for whatever reason for a quarter, it might be shocking. So I think it's, I think the short answer is I don't know how practices would fare with those with quarter to quarter. The other thing that's unknown is that what the in this process, and again, it's not because this is not in any way to denigrate the program or the model, but I know that it takes a while to get reconciliations through the system in terms of financial reconciliation with at least our experience to date with the CMS. I wonder if there are issues related to reconciling, if they can be done within that quarter period, how quickly those reconciliations might occur.
So we have a question from Kathy Chapman and then Bob Atlas.
Yes, I actually have two questions. One, the regional reference, if I understood you correctly, Dr. Haft, you said the state of Maryland would be a region. Is that correct?
Well, I think that's how that would work. I don't know for sure. That's how we do it now for MDPCP, is since it's a state program, that when CMMI creates the benchmark, they use all of the practices in Maryland. And then because we are the majority of those primary care practices, they create a synthetic benchmark using kind of all of the beneficiaries and kind of put them in a hopper and mix them up and say, if we redistributed them to practices that sort of looked like your practices, here's how they might perform statistically, and then they use that as a benchmark. So I believe that's what they're probably they would lean toward doing.
Okay. I would voice some concerns about that because rural environments, the socioeconomic status, transportation, all the things that affect health in rural environments is a whole different ballgame from Montgomery County, Howard County. It's almost comparing apples to oranges. As one in the rural county, that gives me a little better heartburn. Yeah. The other issue I have is you talked about leakage rate, so that if a patient transfers to another primary care practice, then they would no longer be attributed to this. One of the concerns I have as we talk about the next level and practices taking more responsibility and more risk is the accuracy of the timeliness of those beneficiary lists. This past weekend, I went through my beneficiary list, and we have an EMR that I went through it one by one, looking them up. And out of 353 people on our beneficiary list, 107 of them were no longer patients of this practice. That is concerning to me because when they look back is to 2018, but when they're listed as my beneficiary, I'm still responsible if they go to the hospital. I'm responsible for their blood pressure, their hemoglobin A1C. That gives me a little heartburn as well, that if that list of beneficiaries is not timely at the track 3, how is that going to impact the small practice?
Yeah, so Kathy, two answers to kind of a different question. One, in terms of attribution, I think duly noted, attribution is imperfect and has those characteristics that you pointed out, and I don't have a quick and easy answer for how to make it better than that, other than in primary care first, there is an option that patients can self-identify with a particular practice, which I think maybe also means that they can self-de-identify with a practice. That part I'm not sure about, but it is an additional way for to allow for attribution, and that might be something that might be helpful. On the leakage issue, the leakage is not really about it's not about attribution leakage. It's about those patients who are attributed to you if they go to get primary care services some other place. Then the proportion of those services that are provided some other place are taken out as kind of a simple numerator denominator from your payment. So if you had, if your patients had 100, if you had 100 patient months in your practice visits, 100 visits in a month, but 50 of them went to other providers, and you'd only get paid 50% of what that would be your leakage fee for that. You get 50% of whatever your attributed amount was. It just says that if people are going elsewhere, we're not going to pay you for them going elsewhere because we expect you to provide those services. Now, knowing that these are fee-for-service beneficiaries who are free to go anywhere. And the notion is that the practices will be so available and so attractive that the patients will only choose at least to get their primary care services there. So that's what the leakage, that specifically was what the leakage penalty is about.
So that would apply as well, like snowbirds that go to Florida every winter. They would be a leakage, right?
There would be a leakage.
Yeah, so thank you, Kathy. Bob Atlas, and I believe Dr. Berenson may afterwards had a question. Yes, Bob.
Hi, everyone. So it's a lot to absorb, pretty complicated. And I always worry about complicated models because the people who have to perform under them don't always know what they're supposed to do. So just a general comment. I got 3 specific questions, not massive. One is there any chance of varying the quality measures to match what other goals, I guess it's quality measures, to match what's in the Maryland, elsewhere in Maryland, to sync up with quality measures in that hospitals are under, or that might turn up, like relative to population health measures, like the diabetes thing. I'll spit out all 3 questions and then you can respond. Second is, will practices get data on their performance in anything close to real time, where they learn where they're headed on these measures, that they might actually have an opportunity to intervene? Or is this just going to be measured very retrospectively, and you just have to hope that over the long run you come out okay? And thirdly, might there be an opportunity for practices to join together to pool risk? Because the more you slice and dice this stuff, the more, as you all know, my favorite actuarial reference, the law of large numbers, doesn't work when you have a lot of slicing and dicing. So one way to fix that is for practices to pool together, to agree that they would form a simulated larger practice.
Dr. Abt?
Yeah, so Bob, I think those are 3 good questions. One is that first, in terms of do we, under the primary care first, as it is, their practices are not, and regions are not given the ability to alter those measures. Those measures are those measures, and that's what CMMI is. Intends to compare those measures to use that as a test the model. Maryland has been different, so they've allowed us to make our adjustments, and we'll talk about that perhaps in next week. And the advisory council did weigh in on making some recommendations to CMMI, and we should hear in the next week or so about how those recommendations were received. So we would hope that we would be able to continue to do alignment with the state and the advisory council's goals in terms of performance measures. In terms of the real-time ability to see how you're going, I think you pointed out this is a very, very complex model for performance adjustment. And there are some things that practices might have some real-time visibility on. They might certainly would have their hospital utilization we give them that, so they have real-time availability for that. On the how it compares to benchmarks, and of course they're not given. This is not what they're judged by is not the real-time utilization. They're judged on how they compare to a benchmark, both a national and a regional benchmark. We don't have any way of giving them any perfect indication. We've tried to work over the last several months with CMMI and with their contractors and our contractors, and there's no easy way that we can say from quarter to quarter tell the practices how they're doing in advance against those benchmarks. So they would have directional indication, but they wouldn't be specifically aware where they would fall on those benchmarks from quarter to quarter. And on the quality, they wouldn't know until probably 9 months after, as this year, 9 months after the quality is already submitted. They would know whether they would be in the, can't get anything, or will get minus 10%, or available to get up to 50%. That would come to them sometime much later.
Dr. Haft, did you or Bob, did the answer about pooled risk? Do you want to? Do you want to say, Howard, anything?
I didn't hear that one, Howard. Did you?
Well, Bob, I think it's a good idea. And Care First has been doing that with creating artificial panels. CMMI has not done that for their models, but I think that's something that as we conceive of what's the best way to do this, I think that makes great sense in so many ways.
So there's a question that existed from Dr. Berenson, and then Dr. Pham, and then Dr. Okeke.
Okay, I have perhaps a couple of questions. I'm doing a quick look at my iPad here to see whether the AHU is risk adjusted. Apparently, it's clinically risk adjusted, it would appear, based on HCC. Has there been, do I assume there's no socioeconomic risk adjustment at all in the severity adjustment for the AHU measure?
And maybe Michael might know, Michael Barr might know better, but when I looked at it, I saw, as you did, that there's clinical adjustments, and a variety of different clinical adjustments, but it's not, the HEDIS measure does not adjust for socioeconomic factors. I don't think it has a geographic adjustment either.
So Dr. Pham, I think, may have some comment, and then Dr. Barr on that question. So Dr. Pham or Dr. Barr?
Yeah, so on 2 or 3 issues, I've lost count. So Bob, in answer to your question, I do not believe that CMS has ever risk adjusted for socioeconomic status, except in its evaluations in terms of quality scoring. That's an aside. On the idea of risk pooling for both quality measurement and for the financial calculations, I think the idea has potential. I would just point out a few considerations to keep in mind. One, to the extent possible, it should be a deliberate selection of those practices, identifying each other as partners. We know from past experience that when it's artificially done, not much good comes out of it. People, it's like a mini SGR. People are just not going to respond. And then I guess I would ask, to the extent that there are natural groupings based on their reliance on different CTOs, I don't know the market well enough to gauge, but do others have opinions about whether those are already communities of practices that would have more comfort taking on risk together? And then the third point on risk adjustment is and this I would push CMS on for both, well, particular the financial calculations is, they have now developed a high risk adjust HCC variation, right, for direct contracting. There is no, and I didn't understand why in direct contracting they're only applying that to the high needs ACO track as opposed to the outlier population for every ACO. And I would urge Maryland to consider pushing the agency, why not apply that here? I think that would go some distance, not as far as we would want, but some distance to accounting, for example, for dual eligibles. Or other, extremely complex populations that regular HCC scores are not going to really reflect very well, because those R-squareds are like 0.1, and I believe the new algorithm for the outlier population is closer to 0.4, 0.5. It's a huge difference, and I think that may help some of the concerns that the rural practices, the ones dealing with with a high proportion of dual beneficiaries might feel.
Yeah, Dr. Haft, do you have any comment? And then before you respond, we'll go back to after you respond, we'll go back to Dr. Barr to see if he has any comment, and then finish with Dr. Berenson's questions.
So, so I think that's Dr. Fallon, that's a good thought. And we do have, within the MDPCP now, in our complex category, in addition to the HCC scores, we've added in the dementia and pervasive behavioral health disorders to that list. It doesn't necessarily include all of the duals, but part of the thought process in doing that was that a lot of our duals are duals because they have behavioral health disorders. So it takes us part of the way there. But I think your point is very well taken. And and I put this as an if, because I don't think it's a given. If the advisory council and at the end of this process says, yes, this is exactly how we want to adjust our performance, then that would be a good variation on that. I think we'll try and at some point match this up against how we adjust performance, how we adjust payments now under the MDPCP, under the kind of the Maryland model, and see if we can maybe take the best of both worlds at some point, if we find that that's allowable by our colleagues at CMMI.
Great, thank you. Dr. Barr, any comment to what Dr. Berenson had mentioned?
Well, just on the AHU measure, one of our lead measure developers and I have been communicating. It's like, we have raised some issues to CMS about the use of the hospital AHU measure for panels and clinicians, and just let's say there's some issues and concerns that they've raised that you may be aware of, but this use at this level they have some questions about denominator size. Can the prediction models generalize to provider panels? So there are some things to consider, and a lot of weight is being put on the AHU for this model. So more than I am comfortable describing, but happy to provide an offline sort of conversation about that.
Thank you. Dr. Berenson, did we get to all your questions? And
well, then I'll make a comment, and this won't be a question. Given what Michael just said about, I think the spread between -10 and +50 with an untested and probably flawed measure is entirely too great. And it may be that piece that CMMI is imposing that, but it seems to be very similar to what they're doing in MIPS, but not really implementing in MIPS. I think one could do all of this, but narrowing the spread. 34% is too much, 50% is too much, in my opinion, until we get some experience and see who falls into which categories. I'm quite sure that practices serving a low-income population will have a higher hospitalization rate, controlling for their condition. And yet that's not factored in. And then Michael's just raised the potential that that AHU isn't ready for this purpose. And I'm also not, as I've mentioned a few times in the past, I don't think we have a robust set of outpatient quality measures to hold up to that kind of a spread between -10 and +34. So I think we should get our feet wet in quality measurement and rewards and penalties before we go. This is a dramatic change. And the final thing I would put on the table is they've said there's going to be an improvement component, but they haven't said how much that is. I think there needs to be better balance between an improvement bonus and an attainment bonus. But they haven't even specified the improvement bonus. So I think if there's any opportunity, I would agree that the concept of rewards for quality and performance make perfect sense. But I think we're throwing this program into the deep water without any sort of experience.
Dr. Haff, any reaction?
Well, I think my reaction is that this would be a rather sudden and dramatic change, and maybe the little bit of the good news is if we're looking at 2023, we will have 2021 and 2022 to see how other practices fare with these changes, and perhaps there would be in the interim some adjustments in primary care first that could be adopted also. But but I think the point is well taken. This is dramatically different and dramatically more complicated than the system we have now. So that needs to be taken into consideration. And Dr. Berenson, they did say the CMMI in primary care first has indicated that the amount of increase that would be available for continuous improvement is a 16% increase. And it was caveated that all of the other elements can't be below 50%, needs to meet all the quality gateways, et cetera, are included in that.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Okiki, you had a question.
Yeah, my question was just asked, but just to expand on that, the question was on the CI bonus. Given what Kathy had said, that knowing that there will be these fluctuations in payments, possibly, I think the more clarity that the practices can get, the easy it is for them to kind of know what they can own and control. So if you have specific targets, is it 10% improvement? Is it 20% improvement? Right now, as Dr. Haff mentioned, it's 16%. But if we decide to think of it in incremental terms, would it be 5% if we have X improvement percent versus all the entire 16%? And does that vary by practice and the level of capacity, I would say, that they have in order to keep improving? So
NChem, so the 16% is how much more you would get for that quarter. It's not 16% improvement. The improvement measure that they use, as they define it, is a statistically significant improvement over the previous year's performance in acute hospital utilization. But it doesn't say but they have not defined what statistically significant means. And they've left that for to be determined.
Yeah, that's what I meant. So when they do define it, is it going to be an all or none in terms of what they earn in the 16%?
Yeah, the 16% is an all or none feature. Yeah.
Thank you.
David, I think.
David, I muted you.
Thanks.
I think we actually overlooked.
Sorry, the feedback was coming through your line.
One part of Mai's question about whether the CTOs would represent confederations under which practices could be grouped. And I thought Howard may have a point about that, but there are others we purposely included some organizations that are operating CTOs, and maybe there's a little bit of a difference on perspective on this or not. But from afar, I don't. It's plausible, but I'm not sure that CTOs formed particularly for that purpose, so they might have something to say about that idea.
Oh, and I should just clarify, I just meant not that the CTOs would play the risk aggregation function, but that just by virtue of those practices working with that CTO, they know each other a bit better.
Yeah, I understand.
Sorry.
Yeah. And then Gene had to depart early, so he's not with us, but that would be great to answer that, to add comment to your point. Are there,
I think Debbie has a
yes,
respond to that.
Debbie?
Yeah, on that, I think that there's a potential for CTOs to foster that kind of collaboration. I think the challenge is that we're in a situation where everything is practice-based, site-based. And if you think about how the program operates, the CTOs pick a geography and commit to serving that geography. And then practices pick who's available within that geography. And then the CTOs have to agree to serve them, even if they don't know them. So it's not like a organic kind of familiar clustering. We're kind of just all thrown together, and there's not any kind of geographic. There could be multiple CTOs, obviously, in the same geography. But the big point is, as long as everything's by practice site, I think we lose opportunities to really come together. Consumer advisory council meetings and things like that, it could be more congregated. We could foster some more collaboration to achieve that, but not in the way it's currently constructed.
Yeah, and Debbie, I don't know if Stacia's here or not, but I think how Care First has done this is that they've tried to aggregate small practices into pods that are geographically close, and I think they've given them flexibility to say, as Dr. Pham suggested, yes, this is a compatible practice, and yes, we want to work together.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that model because our practices have been in that, but yeah.
Okay. Are there other questions about the material Dr. Haft has discussed at this point, or otherwise we will move on? Okay. Hearing none. Alana, can you screen share on the requirements table? Okay. And with that, let me turn back to Dr. Haft to start the conversation.
Yeah, I think where we left off last week was with the with track 3 required or optional question, and we, as you recall, we spent a good deal of time looking at a couple of graphs that were, as Ben and others pointed out, entirely hypothetical, that showed the kind of what a progression might look like if track 3 was required, but not flexible in any way, so that it might dissuade or be off-putting to some small or medium, or many small medium-sized practices. And I think you get a sense from this last discussion about the performance bonus adjustments, why that might be true for a small or medium-sized practice looking down the barrel of a very significant change from being in track 2, where relatively stable revenues that are adjusted on an annual basis, and going to wide swings on a quarterly basis, potential wide swings on a quarterly basis, and under where they are now in track 2, where they would be coming from track 2, they would have only a portion, of 10-15% of their revenue would be subject to adjustment on an annual basis. In this program, 75% or so of their total Medicare revenue would be subject to larger swings. So that was the consideration in terms of having, whether it's required or optional, would perhaps, based on the wisdom of the advisory council and others, be highly dependent on what track 3 looked like, and whether it offered options in terms of either flexibility or or a glide path up in terms of those swings in terms of revenue. So I think that was where our discussion was leading, and I think that's where I would appreciate getting continuing our comments on that in context of kind of the broader understanding of what the revenue side might look like for particularly small and medium-sized practices.
So I'd like to invite Bob Atlas and then Will Daniels to make a comment on what you've heard thus far.
Well, I don't know that I have a specific comment on this. I remember Dr. Pham brought up a challenge last week, and I think what I said was it's worth discussing, and it sounded like you agreed that we should take it up this week. So that's really my only comment at this point, is to restate that challenge and have a little conversation about it.
Okay, Will, any thoughts here?
No particular thoughts here. Thank you, David.
Okay, so turning back to the group, other reactions, comments, Dr. Barr? Okay.
No comments.
Okay, Dr. Pham? No? Okay. Dr. Berenson, any reaction? Okay. Anyone else have any comments or questions here? So, Dr. Haft, could I get you to just to summarize again, and as succinctly as possible, what you think the action item here is and where you think we're leaving off?
I think the action item would be to suggest to CMMI that in order to maximize the participation in the MDPCP track 3, that there should be some flexibility in terms of the performance bonus adjustments and a ramp up in terms of a progressive ramp up in terms of risk over time.
Okay. With that, why don't we move on to the track transition? And Dr. Happ?
Yeah, so for track transitions, I think where we talked last week was that there would be, assuming that there's flexibility, et cetera, that we would see that all practices would transition. The current track practices coming in 2021, and anyone prior to that would still have an opportunity for 3 years to gain track 2. If they didn't gain track 2 in those 3 years, this is prior starters and also anyone beginning in 21, they would exit the program. Practices beginning in 2022 would only have 2 years to gain track 2 status. If they didn't by the end of those 2 years, so if they came in 22, they'd have 22 and 23, but if they didn't by 24, they would have to exit the program, which would then leave would eliminate track 1 by the end of 24. So practices starting then thereafter would have to begin they would need to qualify for track 2, and they would need to move to track 3 by 2026 in terms of transition. Track 1 practices that either left the program or practices that were novel to the program and not previously could enter track 3 if they met the same basic requirements that practices would be required to enter track 3 de novo from in PCF, which means that they met all of the certified electronic health record requirements, that they had 24/7 coverage, either with coverage or a nurse call line, and that they had experience with with risk, that is an ACO experience or experience in MDPCP. So those would be the, I think, I hope I'm not missing anything, but those would be the transition. So basically phasing out track 1 by 2024 and committing that everyone would be, track 2 would be phased out. Practice would either move to track 3 by 2026 or exit the program.
Okay, we'll let Alana capture some of that, and then reaction from anyone on the council. Dr. Barr.
Real quick question. Is this a one-way progression? So if a practice moves from 2 to 3 before 26 and has some challenges, sees that they're getting penalties, can they move backwards to get themselves ready to come back into 3, or is it only one way?
It's a good question. And currently, there's only one way: you move up or you move out. I think it's a good question, though. If a practice was an early adopter for track 3 in the first year, and then found that they wanted to have one more year, it would only really have 1 year, but until it moved back. If we contemplated eliminating track 2 by 2026, so it wouldn't provide much cover. Me personally, I think having a well thought out and flexible track 3 would be better than having to have practices move back. But I think it's a consideration. Listed as one of the considerations, I think.
Okay. Other comments? Okay. So the way in the optional, looking at the row above, Alana, if you could scroll up just a little bit so people could see, I believe Dr. Haft has pretty much covered what we see above in that final column on the right. Much of that applies to the track transition. If there is nothing additional to add here, we can continue onward.
So David, I would say also the specific question that CMMI asked here, should track 3 be required or optional? And I think what the clear message that we've gotten from CMMI is that it needs to be required, that it's not going not to be an optional track, that at some point in here, if we say 2026, we need to phase out track 2. So there's only one track. I think that's, I'd like to get sense of if there's any disagreement or anyone feels strongly otherwise. That would be it would be a real sticking point for CMMI.
Yeah, that's a good point, Kathy.
Why do practices have to go into track 3? Why can a practice decide, okay, I don't think I can take the risk for track 3, I'm going to stay in track 2? What is the thinking of CMI that you can't go forward? And if that practice decides, okay, I'm not going to track 3, and they opt out of the whole program, have we gained anything in our desire to control costs?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and I think there are reasons, obviously, for wanting to have just a single track that matches up with primary care first. Simply to administer. It would be. I think that there's some concern about even track 2 not having a kind of full alignment with the total cost of care model and accountability that's being sought. And there's also a question of whether track 2 currently takes practices far enough toward kind of what we now recognize sort of as a safe harbor in terms of more capitated system. So I think it's a great question. I would lean more toward having a track 3 that is accommodating to practices in terms of their risk tolerance and flexibility than to try and have 2 separate tracks. I think you put those very well taken.
So Dr. Pham, thank you.
Yeah, Howard, I tend to agree with you because I think it's more likely to, CMS is more likely to be receptive to that. I do want to note that I think the other part of the philosophical bent here is a more general push in CMMI to de-risk CMS.
Yes.
And just to shift as much of that onto providers and the private sector as possible. And I want to note that I think that's a particular philosophy of this administration. And what we may experience in terms of flexibilities combined with, you know, a more overall sense of like the importance of investing in primary care might look very different in a Biden administration. So I know we in CMS have to make some early decisions pretty quickly, but I do think that it's, you know, there's the possibility that things can shift yet again.
Dr. Fromm, I think it's a point very well taken. Not on the, I won't comment on the politics, but I will comment on the heavy reliance on acute hospital utilization for all the things you mentioned before, and for the fact that, and I think Dr. Reedman, the co-chair, has mentioned this many times, that really the primary care providers and practices have some influence on acute hospitalization, but it is not the entire influence. It is not as if they are responsible in this day and age for all that is admitted to the hospital by any stretch of the imagination, or for, you know, for much of what is being emphasized here. And a lot of that has to do with you know regional variations and other things that are well beyond the control of
I think Dr. Haft, again, it may fall on deaf ears at this point, but I do think it's worth having in at least our repertoire of arguments that, you know, it would be one thing to de-risk CMS and give providers all of the care management tools that, for example, exist in MA. But that is not what is happening here. There is no HMO structure, there is no mandatory PCP selection, there's no benefit design to wrap around this that would engage beneficiaries in a more explicit manner. So there's some policy inconsistency in here. And I think that it's fair for us to point that out and to predict that, you know, the chances of this ending well are lessened because there are these policy inconsistencies.
Yeah, I think we'll capture those here in the table, and I think those are very good points you bring up. Dr. Haft, your thoughts?
No, just again, I think that there are emphasis. There is an emphasis here, and clearly in reducing acute hospitalization. And I think you know, Bob Atlas and others have pointed out the fact that it's not consistently or completely or independently on the shoulders, and at least in our model of the primary care providers. And you know, I would say in Maryland, in the total cost of care global budgets, reducing avoidable hospitalization is a team effort here. But to put it all on one side or the other just is probably not. It may be more consistent elsewhere than it is here.
Yeah. Any other reaction or comments? Bob?
Yeah, I guess I agree. The question is, you know, what do we do about it? Other, you know, I mean, we're being asked to sign on to a model that is shaped, not a lot of room for us to adapt it to the local circumstances, you know, so. But I mean, to think that we're going to transfer. I mean, let's remember, primary care in Medicare is what, about 5-6% of total spend. You know, relieving the federal government of that degree of risk when, you know, it's the specialty services, it's the referral services, et cetera. You know, we've already got hospitals under a global budget, so what else is there? And that's a big bolus of other dollars that's not being addressed here, other than through, you know, the indirect and the partial incentive that hospitals have under the total cost of care model.
Any reaction, Dr. Haft, before we move on?
My only reaction would be, I think this advisory council membership is, is very broadly representative, and among some of the smartest people in the country are sitting around thinking about these things together. I think that in the context of an innovative state model like we have in an innovative state, I think we could come up with something better. So I don't feel chained to this, and I think I would look to the council and their guidance and your guidance on how to do it better within this very unique context that we hope is leading the rest of the country toward a better way to improve quality and reduce costs. So I think that's what this exercise is about. Is let's think a little bit out of the box. We may not get everything. You may not get a whole loaf, but if we get we don't think out of the box, we won't get any loaf.
Yeah, very good point, Dr. Haff. Dr. Berenson and then Dr. Okiki.
Yeah, so I just wanted to agree with all of those comments. I just wanted one clarification to Bob. In Medicare, it's only 2.5% of total spending is from primary care. The overall total for total health spending in the country is about 67%. In Medicare, it's a lot less. There's post-acute care, there's DME, there's all of that stuff. And I agree with the whole sentiment that we can do better. So the point I wanted to make, picking up on Mai's comment, was that this is the hand they've dealt us, but it's conceivable we'll have a new dealer. And there's no point in railing against CMMI now, but we should be clear that we're not proponents necessarily of all of this, that this is what we have agreed to do. But this is basically the CMMI model that we are trying to adjust and accommodate, but that we don't necessarily agree with all of the policy decisions we've made. That's all I would suggest.
Very good. Thank you. Dr. Okiki.
Yeah, I was also thinking along the lines of what Dr. Hatt had mentioned in terms of being open or being flexible, because at least I know before COVID, we were already on track to kind of explore what the next steps would be, what improvement would look like. But here comes the demand from CMMI, and we kind of just adjusted and framed and consolidated our efforts to kind of meet their needs. And that's what we've been doing. And I think we've been doing that not knowing that we have any other options. So the question would be, and just from a business perspective, I would work with, the cards I'm dealt, but at the same time, I have my ultimate strategic plan. And when the time is right, then I can go back to those. So is there any appetite, desire after all the hours we spent, quote unquote, meeting the needs as we've been given the charge, to also think about what would be our proposed solution going forward that can now accommodate for other outliers that we're not allowed to kind of put in here, including Kathy's point about what if a practice is best shot at care transformation is being tracked too. Do we have space for that in our states? And I think yes. So things like that, and I hope that we can also have time out of our busy schedule to also consider that as we do this.
So, Dr. Haff, do you get a sense from the policy discussions with CMMI that there's going to be much flexibility here in terms of deviation from primary care first?
I think if there wasn't going to be some flexibility, we wouldn't be having these discussions. I can't tell you what the degree of flexibility is, because at this point our discussions are, with our great colleagues who are at the staff level, we talk to every week, and they're not the ultimate decision makers in terms of that flexibility. That'll be a process that we'll get kind of run up the flagpole in the interim over the next several months, and then go through even a more rigorous process. It goes through clearance over the subsequent year or 18 months, and as Mai and others have pointed out, the people who are making those decisions now may or may not be the same people who are making the decisions in the future. I mean, they'll always change, even during the course of any administration will change. And so will attitudes and policies change, but we're on the cusp of what it's 6 weeks away from an election. That's that obviously has a major influence on policies and other things. So we'll have to see. But I think that we have an obligation to do something better than this. That's more welcoming to practices like Kathy has described, because we have a broader obligation to transform the healthcare of the primary healthcare that's delivered in the state in a beneficial way. And if we only do that for a small number of practices that seem to be pigeonholed into a very narrow kind of program, then we haven't met our obligation. So we have an obligation to make sure that we can make something that works for not just some, but for many practices, and need to be practices that can perform, but the economic requirements need to be broader than what's presented right here.
So are there any other comments before we travel along? Okay, Lana, can you scroll down and back over a little to the left? There we go. Dr. Hatt.
Yeah, I think so. This is what we're modeling on now. So I think we want to, again, relevant to the last question, people want to know, well, what is my risk? How will I generally fare? How much of my revenue is going to be coming out of this program as compared to, it's at risk compared to what we saw in track 2. And we don't have an answer to that just yet, but we will have an answer. We've brought on some folks who are contractors who can help us model that out, and they're working on that now. So I think for now, the question about total monthly payments, adjustments, and those things, I think would be best answered when we have a kind of more of a side-by-side comparison that can tell us, compared, if we took all the practices and assumed everybody was in track 2, given the same beneficiaries, and then we compared what the overall revenue for all of our practices are, not at the individual practice level, but for the whole program, and then compared it to Primary Care First. If we were all in that, how does it compare? Is it the same? Is it better? Is it worse? And by what degree? And I think then we'll be able to kind of get a better estimate in terms of then if we applied risk to that, some -10 to +50, how practices might how it might affect the practices overall.
And Dr. Haft, are we expecting any information early in October that might inform the council's discussions here?
Yes, I think we'll get some preliminary information, and it might not be enough to form a decision, but is the information enough to maybe perhaps ask some more what-if questions in terms of how we define these payments. And in the first, perhaps one of the early ones will be if as Primary Care First is configured, practices would be cast into groups 1, 2, 3, and 4, which would define their payments. What percentage of practices would be each of those groups would also define how much they're getting paid. And if we find that there's most of the practices are in a group that compares negatively from Primary Care First to track 2, it might be one decision. If we find that most of the practices are in groups that compare positively, it might define a different way. I think it's probably going to be, my guess is, since these are usually done on an actuarial basis, that it's going to be pretty close to a wash. Dr. Berenson or Dr. Pham or others who have more experience with this might have a different opinion, but my guess is it will be overall a wash, and we can maybe dismiss this and move on to more of the performance adjustments and other issues. But I think we'll let the numbers lead us along those lines.
Yeah, makes sense. So we're 5 minutes before the departure time, 6:30. I would invite Dr. Reedman. Are you still available to weigh in or offer any insight to the meeting? And we realized we might have some challenges with his connectivity, given his location in South Carolina. So why don't we, Alana, just give the advisory council a sense of the items that we'll talk about next week. Can you go back to the table and let's scroll down so we can tee up what will be on the agenda? So we'll be looking at the performance-based adjustment, and as a matter of first, and then we'll be talking about attribution and beneficiary engagement incentives. Then we'll have some additional items brought up for discussion, but these will be the holdover from the items we were thinking we might get to during this meeting. Dr. Haft, any final remarks?
No, not really. I think this was, again, a wonderful discussion. I think we're making some great points, and I think we're making some progress. So a couple of those things for next week, attribution and beneficiary engagement, I think will be much easier. So we'll knock a couple more easy ones off.
Very good. Thank you. And to our executive director, Ben?
Just very briefly, I want to thank our staff that's assisted David, Melanie, Alana, Anene. They do really keep this process going. I won't say anything more because I know many of you want to break for the big event tonight. Of course, I'm talking about the Yankees-Indian baseball game at 7 o'clock. But I think Melanie had something to add as well.
Yes.
Just logistics at the end. So Ben, are you done?
Yes.
Okay. Just a couple logistical things. So prior to the meetings, we post the meeting materials and the call-in information on the main MHCC meeting schedule page. Post meetings, we post them on the MHCC page. We post the table that we've taught with the discussion items. We post a very high-level summary, and we post the recording of the meetings. If anyone has any questions about any of the items, they're reach out to. We did do with that today, and I guess I'll just say we did discover that the problem is trying to go through and it worked much better through Chrome. So if anyone is having a similar issue, they may just want to try Chrome versus Explorer. So that's it, Dave. I'll turn it back to you, meeting.
Very good. Okay, with that, thank you everyone for your participation today. As others have noted, it was a great conversation, and we look forward to your continued involvement next week. So if there's any questions in the meantime, please feel free to reach out to any of us here, and have a great evening, and thanks again for your time. I'll see you.
Thank you, David.